Arizona Territory, 1885. The dry heat rippled across the cracked earth as a lone figure on horseback traversed the unforgiving landscape. Bryce Lawson pulled his bandana higher over his nose, shielding his lungs from the dust kicked up by his mare's hooves. At 25, his shoulders already carried the weight of a lifetime of solitude. His handsome features, square jaw, deep blue eyes that reflected the vast western sky, and a perpetual light stubble that never seemed to grow into a proper beard, remained set in a stoic expression. "Just you and me, Daisy," he muttered to his horse, patting her neck as they crested a ridge overlooking the vast Ponderosa Valley. The harsh reality of frontier life had taught Bryce one fundamental truth. Attachment was vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed. After watching Apache raids claim his parents when he was just 16 and losing his mentor to typhoid 2 winters past, Bryce had sealed his heart behind an impenetrable wall. He'd built the Double L Ranch from nothing, working his fingers to the bone, pushing away any who tried to get close. "A man stands alone out here," he'd tell the occasional drifter seeking work. "The moment you rely on others is the moment you set yourself up for heartbreak." What Bryce truly wanted was simple: to expand his herd, strengthen his fences, and survive another season. What he refused to acknowledge was the emptiness that greeted him each night in his lonely cabin, the silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing year. The small town of Promise Creek lay in the valley below. Bryce rarely ventured into town except for supplies, preferring the honest company of cattle to the complicated nature of people. But today, necessity drove him toward civilization. His rifle needed repairs, and the supply wagon wasn't due for another 3 weeks. As he guided Daisy down the winding path toward town, he noticed a plume of smoke rising from the eastern hills, from Apache land. The sight sent a familiar chill down his spine. The uneasy truce between settlers and the local Apache band had held for nearly 2 years, but tensions were always simmering just beneath the surface. "Best make this quick," he muttered, urging Daisy to a faster pace. Promise Creek consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings: a general store, blacksmith, saloon, small hotel, and the sheriff's office. As Bryce hitched Daisy outside the general store, he heard the unmistakable sound of conflict inside. "I said no credit, miss. Times are hard for everyone. Please, Mr. Jenkins. My father will pay when he returns next week. We just need enough to get by until then." Bryce hesitated at the doorway, his hand on the frame. The voice belonged to a young woman he'd never seen before. He entered quietly, observing the scene. She stood with her back to him, her posture straight despite her pleading tone. Her dress was simple but well made, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was impeccably clean. Her hair, the color of rich mahogany, was pulled back in a practical braid that reached halfway down her back. "The answer's still no, Miss Summers. Your father's credit is already stretched thin," Jenkins said firmly, noticing Bryce's entrance with a nod of acknowledgement. The young woman's shoulders slumped momentarily before straightening again. She turned to leave, nearly colliding with Bryce. He caught a glimpse of startlingly green eyes, flushed cheeks, and a delicate but determined chin. "Excuse me," she murmured, averting her gaze as she attempted to step around him. "Hold on," Bryce heard himself say, surprising even himself. "Add the lady's needs to my account, Jenkins." Those green eyes snapped up to meet his, suspicion replacing embarrassment. "I don't accept charity from strangers, sir." Bryce Lawson. He introduced himself with a tip of his hat. "Owner of the Double L. And it's not charity. Your father can settle with me when he returns." "Clara Summers," she replied coolly. "And my family pays their debts." Something about her fierce pride despite obvious need struck Bryce. It mirrored his own stubborn self-reliance, yet there was a warmth in her defiance that he lacked. "Consider it neighborly then," Bryce suggested. "These are hard times." Jenkins cleared his throat. "Miss Summers here and her father have that old Harrington place, just south of your property line, Lawson. They moved in about 3 months back while you were driving cattle north." Bryce raised an eyebrow. The Harrington place had been abandoned for years, a difficult plot with poor soil and a troublesome water situation. No wonder they were struggling. Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "We're managing just fine. Father just had to go to Tucson for supplies we couldn't get locally. Leaving you alone." The words slipped out before Bryce could stop them, his tone more accusatory than he intended. Clara's eyes flashed. I'm perfectly capable of handling myself, Mr. Lawson. I'm 20 years old and have lived on the frontier my entire life. Bryce found himself both irritated and intrigued by her spirit. Most women he encountered were either hardened by frontier life or broken by it. Clara Summers seemed to have forged something different, a strength that hadn't sacrificed softness. The lady will take what she needs, Bryce told Jenkins firmly, and I'll have my usual supplies plus extra ammunition. As Jenkins began gathering items, an unexpected commotion erupted outside. Horses galloped into town, and voices rose in alarm. Bryce instinctively moved toward the window, hand dropping to his revolver. Sheriff Miller was speaking with a Native American man dressed in a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and frontier wear. The man's face was set in urgent lines as he gestured toward the eastern hills. Wait here, Bryce instructed Clara, moving toward the door. I take orders from no one, Mr. Lawson, she replied, following close behind. Outside, the tension was palpable. Townspeople gathered at a cautious distance as Sheriff Miller tried to calm the growing murmurs. This is Nahilze, the sheriff explained to the gathering crowd. He's Lieutenant White's interpreter from Fort Duncan. Says there's trouble brewing. Nahilze's eyes scanned the crowd until they settled on Bryce. With a direct gesture, he addressed him specifically. White man with the blue eyes and strong horse. You know the old iron horse that sleeps in the canyon? Bryce frowned. The abandoned locomotive in Rattlesnake Pass? From the mining company that went bust. Nahilze nodded. Chief Kitchian says you must come. Now. Sheriff Miller shook his head. Now wait a minute, why me? Bryce demanded, cutting off the sheriff. The chief says you have honest eyes, unlike the blue coats. This cannot wait. Nahilze's tone left no room for debate. Bryce felt the weight of the town's stairs. The abandoned locomotive had been sitting in that remote pass for nearly 5 years, a failed attempt to establish a mining route before the company went bankrupt. What could possibly be so urgent about it now? It could be a trap, Sheriff Miller warned quietly. If Chief Kitchian wanted me dead, he wouldn't announce it to the entire town, Bryce reasoned. Clara stepped forward unexpectedly. I'll go with you. Absolutely not, Bryce and Sheriff Miller said in unison. My father studied the native languages at university, Clara explained. I speak some Apache. Not fluently, but enough to help if there's a misunderstanding. Nahilze looked at her with newfound interest. The chief brings only one white man. The woman may come if she wishes. Bryce moved closer to Clara, lowering his voice. This is madness. You don't know me, and you certainly don't know what we're riding into. Clara's green eyes met his without wavering. My father always said understanding between peoples only happens when someone is willing to step across the divide. I'm willing. Something shifted in Bryce's chest, a reluctant admiration coupled with frustration. This woman was either the bravest or the most foolish person he'd encountered. Either way, he couldn't let her ride into potential danger alone. Fine, he conceded, turning back to Nahilze. We'll come, but we ride our own horses, and we leave now. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Miller pulled Bryce aside. I'll gather some men and follow at a distance. If you're not back by sundown, no, Bryce interrupted firmly. That's exactly the kind of misunderstanding that could start a war. Trust me to handle this. Within minutes, Bryce, Clara, and Nahilze were riding east, leaving the worried murmurs of Promise Creek behind them. The terrain grew increasingly rocky as they approached Apache territory, following game trails that wound through scrub brush and juniper. Bryce kept his attention divided between their Apache guide and Clara, who rode with surprising skill despite her simple dress. She'd borrowed a wide-brimmed hat from the general store to shield her face from the relentless sun. You ride well for a city girl, Bryce commented as they navigated a particularly steep incline. Clara smiled faintly. My father was a professor, not a city dweller. We've moved between frontier settlements my whole life. After my mother passed, it was just the two of us, always seeking the next opportunity. And he thought an abandoned ranch in the Arizona territory was that opportunity? Her smile faded. The war changed him. He fought for the Union, came back different. Said he needed open spaces and honest work to heal his mind. The simplicity of her explanation stirred something in Bryce, a recognition of the scars that frontier life inflicted visible and invisible alike. "Why did you really come along?" he asked after a long silence. Clara considered her answer carefully. "Because sometimes fate presents you with a door, and you must either walk through it or spend your life wondering what was on the other side." Before Bryce could respond, Nahilze raised his hand for silence. They had reached the ridge overlooking Rattlesnake Pass, where the abandoned locomotive sat like a sleeping iron giant, partially reclaimed by the desert. Below, a small group of Apache warriors waited, their faces solemn. At their center stood Chief Kitchian, distinguished by the eagle feathers in his hair and his commanding presence despite his advancing years. Nahilze led them down the rocky path. Bryce noticed Clara's knuckles were white as she gripped her reins, but her face remained composed. Chief Kitchian stepped forward as they dismounted. He spoke several sentences in Apache, his eyes never leaving Bryce's face. "The chief says you have built fences but not pointed guns at his hunters when they cross your land," Nahilze translated. "He has watched you work the earth with your own hands, not with slaves or servants. This is why he called for you." Bryce nodded respectfully. "Tell him I appreciate his words. Ask him why we're here." After Nahilze translated, the chief gestured toward the locomotive. Two warriors stepped aside, revealing the entrance to the abandoned engine car. "3 suns ago, our hunters found something inside the iron horse," Nahilze explained. "The chief believes it concerns white man's justice, not Apache justice." Clara unexpectedly spoke several halting phrases in Apache. The chief's weathered face registered surprise, then something like approval. He responded at length. "I told him we come in peace and with respect," Clara explained to Bryce. "He says what's inside the locomotive must be removed before it brings evil spirits to their hunting grounds." Chief Kitchian made a decisive gesture. "He wants you to see for yourself," Nahilze translated. Bryce approached the locomotive cautiously, Clara close behind. The metal exterior had rusted in the harsh conditions, but the structure remained largely intact. The door to the engine compartment hung askew on damaged hinges. The smell hit him first, the unmistakable odor of death. Bryce drew his bandana over his nose and motioned for Clara to stay back, but she shook her head stubbornly. Inside, illuminated by shafts of sunlight penetrating through bullet holes in the metal shell, lay 3 bodies. 2 men dressed in once fine suits, now bloated in death, and a third figure bound at the wrists and ankles. "Dear God," Clara whispered, turning away briefly before forcing herself to look again. Bryce examined the scene without touching anything. The 2 suited men had been shot at close range. The third, the bound man, wore the remnants of a U.S. cavalry uniform, his throat cut with precision. "These men have been dead at least a week," Bryce observed grimly. "But why bring us here? Why not alert the fort?" Clara had moved to examine something on the floor. Papers scattered near one of the suited men's bodies. "Bryce," she called, her voice tense. "Look at these." The papers were land deeds and contracts, along with a map of the territory. As Bryce studied them, his blood ran cold. The documents detailed a fraudulent scheme to declare Apache treaty lands abandoned and sell them to mining interests. Most disturbing were the forged signatures of several tribal leaders, including Chief Kitchian. They were planning to steal the reservation lands. Bryce muttered, gathering the papers. The soldier must have discovered it and was silenced. When they emerged from the locomotive, Chief Kitchian was waiting expectantly. Clara spoke to him directly in her limited Apache, with Nahilze helping to clarify her words. She explained what they had found, showing the chief the documents with his forged signature. The chief's face darkened with anger, but he remained controlled as he responded. "He says the blue-coat soldier came to their village 3 weeks ago, asking questions about white men offering gifts for signatures," Nahilze translated. The soldier disappeared. The chief feared his people would be blamed for these deaths if they were discovered by other white men. "He's right," Bryce agreed. "The army would assume Apache involvement immediately." Clara turned to Bryce, her face pale but determined. "We need to get these documents to the territorial governor. This is evidence of criminal conspiracy." Chief Kitchian spoke again, his tone grave. "The chief says there is more," Nahilze translated. "The men who did this have friends in your town. Friends who wear badges and carry law papers." The implication was clear. They couldn't trust the local authorities. This conspiracy reached into Promise Creek itself. We'll need to travel to Prescott, Bryce decided, the territorial capital. But first, we need to document everything and move these bodies somewhere they can be properly identified. As they worked out a plan, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Bryce's hand moved to his revolver as the Apache warriors took defensive positions. "We've been followed," he growled. 6 riders appeared at the ridge, Sheriff Miller and 5 townsmen, including Jenkins from the general store and Judge Calloway, the circuit judge who happened to be in town. "Looks like we arrived just in time," Sheriff Miller called out, his hand resting purposefully on his holstered gun. "Step away from the Apache, Lawson." Bryce positioned himself subtly between Clara and the newcomers. "Everything's fine here, Sheriff. Just a misunderstanding about an abandoned locomotive." Judge Calloway urged his horse forward. "The sheriff says the Apache dragged you out here. We came to ensure your safety." Something in the judge's tone raised Bryce's suspicions. Calloway had arrived in the territory only months ago, appointed by officials back east. His eyes kept darting toward the locomotive. Clara touched Bryce's arm lightly. "The judge's name is on one of the documents," she whispered, "as a witness to the land transfers." Chief Kitchian and his warriors remained still but watchful, hands ready on their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "There are 3 bodies in that locomotive," Bryce announced loudly, "including a cavalry officer, murdered alongside men carrying fraudulent land documents." Sheriff Miller's expression revealed nothing, but Judge Calloway's face drained of color. "Serious accusations require serious evidence," the judge said, his voice strained. "As the judicial representative here, I should examine these alleged documents immediately." "I think they need to go straight to Governor Triddle," Bryce countered, "along with our testimony about what we found." The sheriff exchanged glances with the judge. "Hand over whatever you found, Lawson. That's an order." In that moment, Bryce made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He shifted his stance, squared his shoulders, and said clearly, "No." What followed happened with stunning rapidity. Judge Calloway drew a concealed derringer. Sheriff Miller reached for his revolver. The Apache warriors raised their bows. Clara, with unexpected swiftness, flung herself toward Bryce as the judge's derringer discharged. They tumbled behind the locomotive's wheel assembly as chaos erupted. Gunfire exchanged with the whistling of arrows. Horses screamed in panic. "Are you hurt?" Bryce demanded, checking Clara for injuries as they huddled behind the iron shield. "No," she gasped, her eyes wide but focused. "But you are." Bryce glanced down to see blood spreading across his shirt sleeve. A graze, nothing serious. More concerning was their position, trapped between armed conspirators and Apache warriors who might decide all white people were enemies. "We need those documents," Clara said. "They're the only proof." The papers were scattered where they dropped them in the initial chaos. Reaching them meant exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions. "Stay here," Bryce ordered, preparing to make a dash for the documents. Clara grabbed his arm. "Together. They won't expect both of us." Before he could argue, she was moving, staying low and using the locomotive for cover. With a muttered curse, Bryce followed, providing covering fire toward the sheriff's position. They reached the scattered papers just as an arrow thudded into the ground inches from Clara's hand. Chief Kitchian shouted commands to his warriors in Apache, and suddenly the arrows were directed exclusively toward the sheriff's party. Clara gathered the documents, stuffing them into her bodice for safekeeping as Bryce pulled her toward better cover. The firefight was brief but intense. When the smoke cleared, Sheriff Miller lay wounded but alive. 2 of his men were dead, and Judge Calloway and the others had fled on horseback. Chief Kitchian approached Bryce and Clara cautiously, speaking to Nahilze. "The chief says you have proven your words with actions," the interpreter explained. "He will send warriors to track the fleeing white men. But you must take the evidence to your great chief before more blood is spilled." Bryce nodded, helping Clara to her feet. "Tell him we'll ride immediately for Prescott. The governor will send federal marshals, not local law." As they prepared to leave, Clara addressed the chief directly in his language. The old man's face softened momentarily, and he replied with dignity. "What did you say to him?" Bryce asked as they mounted their horses. "I promised that his people's land would remain theirs," she replied simply. "And I thanked him for trusting us when he had every reason not to." They rode hard through the afternoon. taking an indirect route to avoid being followed. By nightfall, they were forced to make camp in a sheltered arroyo, both too exhausted to continue safely in the dark. As Bryce tended a small, carefully concealed fire, Clara examined his injured arm. "It needs cleaning," she insisted, tearing a strip from her petticoat to serve as a bandage. "I've had worse from breaking in new boots," Bryce replied, but he submitted to her ministrations nonetheless. Her fingers were gentle, yet sure as they cleaned and bound the wound. The intimacy of her care stirred something long dormant in Bryce, a longing for connection he'd deliberately suppressed for years. "Why did you really help me in the general store today?" Clara asked suddenly, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. Bryce considered deflecting the question, but found himself answering honestly. "Because you reminded me of myself when I first came here. Too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit when I needed it. And look at us now," she said with a small smile. "Running for our lives together when this morning we were strangers." "Still think fate was leading you through the right door?" he asked wryly. Clara's smile deepened. More than ever. They fell silent, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The gravity of their situation settled between them. They were now fugitives from corrupt local law, carrying evidence that could incite a frontier war if mishandled. "We should reach Prescott by tomorrow evening if we start at first light," Bryce said eventually. "The governor's a fair man. He'll listen." Clara nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "And if the judge reaches him first with his own version of events? Then we'll have to be very convincing," Bryce replied. "Get some rest. I'll take first watch." As Clara settled by the fire, Bryce positioned himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking their camp. The vast starlit sky stretched endlessly above him, the same sky he'd gazed up at countless lonely nights on his ranch. For the first time in years, that loneliness felt like a choice rather than an inevitability. The realization was as unsettling as it was liberating. Dawn broke with alarming news. The distinctive dust cloud of riders approached from the south, at least a dozen men moving fast. "We need to move," Bryce urged, helping Clara break camp with practiced efficiency. They mounted quickly, heading northwest through increasingly rugged terrain. Bryce led them through narrow canyons and across dry creek beds, using every trick he knew to obscure their trail. "They're still following," Clara observed as they paused atop a ridge to rest the horses. "How do they keep finding our trail?" Bryce frowned, scanning the horizon. "Someone who knows this land as well as I do is tracking us. Probably one of the ranch hands Judge Calloway hired." Their path forward was limited. To the north lay open plains where they'd be visible for miles. To the west, the route to Prescott, equally exposed. East would take them back toward Apache territory, risky, but perhaps their only option. "We need to separate," Bryce decided reluctantly. "You take the documents and head east. The Apache will give you passage if you mention Chief Kitchian. I'll lead the posse west." "Absolutely not," Clara refused flatly. "They'll kill you. Better one of us makes it with the evidence than both of us are caught." Clara dismounted, standing directly in his path. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself." The fierce determination in her eyes struck Bryce to his core. This woman he'd known for barely a day was willing to risk everything alongside him rather than save herself. "Why?" he demanded. "Why risk your life for this?" "For me. Because some things are worth the risk," she answered simply. "Justice. Truth." She hesitated, then added more softly, "Connection." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotion. Then the distant sound of hooves broke the spell. "There's another option," Bryce said suddenly. "My ranch. We're only about 3 miles from the north boundary. There's a lined shack by the creek with supplies and fresh horses." They rode hard, pushing their exhausted mounts to their limits. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Double L Ranch land, Bryce felt a surge of emotion. This land represented everything he'd built alone, his fortress against the world. Now he was bringing danger directly to its doorstep. The lined shack was a simple one-room structure nestled against a rocky hillside, partially hidden by cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. They approached cautiously, alert for signs that the posse had anticipated their move. Inside, the shack was dusty but well-stocked. Ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, and most importantly, a hidden trapdoor leading to a root cellar that could serve as an emergency shelter. "We'll rest the horses and ourselves," Bryce decided. Ride for Prescott at nightfall, when we'll have better cover. As Clara helped tend the horses, Bryce found himself watching her with newfound appreciation. Despite exhaustion and danger, she worked without complaint, her movements economical and purposeful. "You surprise me, Clara Summers," he said as they shared a simple meal inside the shack. "How so?" "Most people show their true nature under pressure. They crumble, or they fight, or they run. You just adapt. Like you've been preparing for this all your life." Clara smiled faintly. "Perhaps I have been, in a way. My father always said life is mostly about losing things gracefully and finding new paths forward. Is that why you came west? Looking for a new path?" She nodded. "After the war, we moved constantly. Father would find teaching positions in frontier towns, but his nightmares. People grew uncomfortable around him. Eventually, we decided to stop running, to build something permanent." "And now you're running again," Bryce observed quietly. "No," Clara corrected him. "Now I'm fighting. There's a difference." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant but unmistakable sound of dogs barking, tracking hounds. The posse had found their trail after all. "They're coming from the south," Bryce said, peering through the small window. "We need to move now." Clara gathered the documents while Bryce collected ammunition and supplies. They had just reached the horses when the first riders appeared on the ridge. "Too late," Bryce muttered. Back to the shack. They barricaded themselves inside, Bryce positioning himself at the window with his rifle while Clara checked the back door was secured. "Lawson," Sheriff Miller's voice carried across the distance. "We just want the documents. Hand them over, and the girl can go free. And if we refuse?" Bryce called back. "Then things get uncomfortable for everyone." Clara moved beside Bryce, her face set with determination. "They'll burn us out if they have to." "There's still the root cellar," Bryce reminded her. "You could hide the documents there, maybe yourself too, and leave you to face them alone?" "No." The standoff stretched through the afternoon, punctuated by occasional warning shots from both sides. As dusk approached, Bryce noticed the posse members conferring, then spreading out to surround the shack. "They're making their move soon," he warned Clara. "Get ready." The attack came from multiple directions, gunfire from the ridge forcing them away from the windows, while others rushed the doors. Bryce fired carefully, making each shot count, while Clara reloaded weapons with surprising efficiency. The posse retreated after their initial assault failed, but not before someone managed to throw a lit torch onto the shack's dry wooden roof. Smoke began filtering through the ceiling boards as flames took hold. "We need to get out," Bryce coughed, the interior rapidly filling with smoke. "The cellar won't help if the whole place collapses on us." Clara pressed the precious documents into Bryce's hands. "Take these. I have a plan." Before he could question her, she had torn strips from her petticoat and was soaking them in water from their canteen. "Wet cloth over our faces will help with the smoke," she explained. "We go out the back during their next assault. They'll be focused on the front." Bryce stared at her in amazement. This woman, who'd walked into his life by chance just yesterday, was now fighting alongside him with a courage that matched or exceeded his own. "Clara," he began, then stopped, words failing him. She met his gaze, understanding what he couldn't say. "I know," she said simply. "Me too." The moment was interrupted by renewed gunfire. The roof was now fully ablaze, sections beginning to collapse. "Now," Clara urged, leading the way to the back door. They burst out into the gathering darkness, staying low and using the smoke for cover. They had almost reached the shelter of the creek bed when a shout went up. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet as they ran. Clara stumbled suddenly, crying out in pain. Bryce turned back to see her clutching her leg, blood seeping between her fingers. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms and continued running, zigzagging toward the rocky hillside behind the creek. A bullet grazed his shoulder, but adrenaline kept him moving until they reached a narrow crevice in the rocks, barely large enough to squeeze through but offering temporary shelter. "How bad?" he asked, examining her wound in the dim light. "Just a graze," she insisted, though her face was pale with pain. "The documents?" "Safe," he assured her, patting his shirt where he'd tucked them. Outside their hiding place, voices and footsteps searched methodically. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. "Bryce," Clara whispered, gripping his hand. "If we don't make it, we will," he interrupted fiercely. "But if we don't," she persisted. I need you to know that meeting you, it matters to me. You matter. The simple truth of her words penetrated all the defenses Bryce had built around his heart. In this moment of extremity, with death potentially moments away, the belief that had guided his life, that attachment was vulnerability, and vulnerability was weakness, crumbled completely. Clara Summers, he said softly, if we survive this, I'm never letting you go. A smile illuminated her face despite the pain and danger. Is that a promise, Mr. Lawson? Before he could answer, the unmistakable sound of war cries echoed through the night, followed by renewed gunfire and shouts of alarm. Apache, Bryce breathed in disbelief. The next hours passed in a blur of confusion. Bryce ventured out once to confirm what he suspected. Chief Kitchian's warriors had arrived, driving off the posse in a surprise attack. By dawn, 3 figures appeared at their hiding place, Nahilze and 2 warriors. The chief received your message, Nahilze explained as they helped Clara from the crevice. The woman with fire hair who speaks our words must be protected. What message? Bryce asked, confused. Clara smiled weakly. I sent a young Apache boy who was watching us yesterday to carry word to the chief. I wasn't certain he understood, but I had to try. The Apache helped them to fresh horses, providing medical attention for Clara's wound. By mid-morning, they were on their way to Prescott with an Apache escort ensuring no further pursuit. They reached the territorial capital 2 days later. Governor Triddle received them immediately upon hearing their story, examining the documents with growing concern. These are serious charges against appointed officials, he said gravely. I'll telegraph the federal marshal's office immediately. You two will remain under protection until this is resolved. The following weeks were a whirlwind of depositions, investigations, and arrests. Judge Calloway and Sheriff Miller were taken into federal custody, along with several businessmen connected to the land scheme. Chief Kitchian was invited to Prescott for formal recognition of his tribe's treaty rights, marking an unprecedented step toward reconciliation. Throughout it all, Bryce remained at Clara's side as her injury healed. They stayed in a small boarding house near the governor's mansion, their constant proximity transforming initial attraction into deeper understanding and affection. Your father returned to Promise Creek, Bryce told Clara one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. The governor sent a rider to inform him of your whereabouts. He should arrive tomorrow. Clara nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety crossing her face. I've been thinking about what comes next. For us, I mean. I have too, Bryce admitted. He took her hand in his, still marveling at how natural it felt. I'm returning to my ranch once the federal marshals clear everything. I'd like you to come with me. As what, Mr. Lawson? Clara asked, her tone light, but her eyes serious. Your neighbor? Your friend? Bryce smiled, the expression no longer feeling foreign on his face. As my wife, if you'll have me. Her eyes widened. We've only known each other 3 weeks. And in that time you've saved my life, changed my heart, and shown me that everything I believed about surviving alone was wrong. He knelt before her, still holding her hand. I love you, Clara Summers. I think I started falling the moment you refused my help in the general store. Tears glistened in Clara's green eyes. And I love you, Bryce Lawson. I think I knew when you refused to leave me behind, even when it was the sensible thing to do. Their wedding took place 2 months later on the Double L Ranch, with Clara's father giving her away and Chief Kitchian attending as an honored guest. The abandoned Harrington place was absorbed into the Double L, with Clara's father taking up residence in a newly built cabin nearby, where he established a small school for both settler and Apache children. As for the locomotive that had brought them together, Governor Triddle ordered it preserved as evidence until the trials concluded. Afterward, Bryce and Clara decided to have it transported piece by piece to their ranch. Not to restore it, but to transform it. The metal was repurposed for tools, fencing, and most significantly, the frame of the new ranch house they built together. From conspiracy to home, Clara remarked as they stood arm in arm, watching the final section of their new house being completed using the locomotive's wheels as decorative elements flanking the entrance. Who would have thought? Bryce pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her growing belly where their first child was beginning to show. The Apache dragged this rancher to an abandoned locomotive, and what was inside changed everything, he said with a smile. It led me to you, and you led me home. Clara stretched up to kiss him, her lips soft against his. "Not just a home," she corrected, "but a family. Something neither of us thought we'd find out here." As the sun set over their land, painting the vast Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Bryce Lawson finally understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The frontier wasn't just a place of hardship and solitude. It was also a place where love could take root and flourish, stronger for the harsh conditions that tested it. And in Clara's arms, he had found not weakness, but his greatest strength.